If you have ever left everything familiar behind and wondered whether you would ever truly belong somewhere new, this story understands that feeling. It is about a piece of land, an old promise nobody remembered anymore, and someone who was not sure she had any right to call it home. The answer is not what you would expect. Here is where it begins. The pump handle came up dry on a third try. Vera Kessler stood at the well house a little after 6 in the morning, one hand braced on the rusted casing, listening to the sound air makes when it has nothing behind it. Not water, just breath from an empty throat. She was 52 years old, and this was the first summer she had ever owned land. 6 weeks earlier, she had been living above a dry cleaner's in the city, answering emails from a job that no longer existed. Now she owned 90 acres in Briar Hollow, Oakridge County, left to her by her Aunt Opal, and 40 head of cattle that did not yet trust her, and a well that had just quit on the hottest week of August. Vera did not call herself a farmer. She had said the word out loud exactly once to a woman at the feed store, and it had felt like wearing someone else's coat. What she called herself, most days, was someone trying not to fail at the one thing her aunt had trusted her with. Opal had never married, never had children of her own, and had spent 40 years running this place alone after her husband died young. Vera had visited twice a year growing up, 2 weeks every summer, long enough to remember the smell of hay in the loft, and not long enough to learn anything useful about keeping a farm alive. When the will named her the sole heir, distant cousins had assumed she'd sell within a year. Vera had assumed the same thing for a while. Then she'd stood in the kitchen the week after the funeral, looking at a drawer full of Opal's reading glasses, 3 pairs, each one worn along a different groove of habit, and something in her had refused to make the call to a realtor. She told herself it was practical. Selling took months. Waiting cost nothing. She did not examine the feeling much closer than that, because underneath the practical reason was another one she wasn't ready to say out loud, even to herself. She did not want to be the Kessler who let it go. The cattle needed water by noon. That was the fact sitting on her chest heavier than anything else. She walked back to the farmhouse kitchen, where a box of Opal's papers still sat, unopened on the table, and she started going through it the way a person goes through a stranger's desk, hoping for an answer she doesn't know how to ask for. She had tried the pump twice more before giving up, priming it the way a neighbor had shown her weeks earlier, listening for the particular gurgle that meant the line was catching. It never came, just the same hollow rasp, over and over, air moving through pipe that had nothing left to push. By 7, sweat had soaked through the back of her shirt, and she still hadn't eaten breakfast. The morning was already climbing past 90 degrees, the kind of Ozark heat that made the whole hollow smell like dust and cut hay, and somewhere down the fence line a calf ball for water it wasn't going to get from her that hour. Vera called the county extension line first, mostly out of instinct, and got a recording. She called the well company that had serviced Opal's place for years and learned they'd closed for good the previous winter. The owner retired to Florida with no one left to take his calls. She sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of water she suddenly felt guilty drinking, and pulled the box of Opal's papers toward her, telling herself she was looking for a service record, a receipt, anything with a phone number on it. Deep in the box, under a folder of tax receipts, she found the original deed. It was dated 1951, typed on onion skin paper on the color of weak tea, and near the bottom, in the section describing the property's boundaries, one line had been underlined in pencil by someone long dead. Water at the Walnut, 40 rods north of the fence corner. Vera read it twice. She had no idea what a rod was, and she had never seen a walnut tree anywhere on the property. But something about the underline, someone had cared enough to mark that line, made her fold the deed in her back pocket and walk out toward the north fence before she'd even finished her coffee. She found the fence corner easily enough, an old iron stake half swallowed by grass. She paced off what she guessed were 40 rods, using the length of her own stride, and arrived at nothing but a stump. A wide one, waist high, the wood gone gray and soft, split down the middle like a bowl that had been left out in 100 winters. There was no tree. There hadn't been a tree there in a very long time. Vera stood over the stump with the deed in her hand, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Briar Hollow, she said out loud, to no one, "So now what?" By 9 that morning, A truck from Callahan Water Solutions was parked in her yard. The technician's name was Nathan Cole, 26 years old, confident in the way that comes from trusting a machine more than a feeling. He carried a handheld locator that could read soil resistivity down at 80 feet, he told her, and he ran it in slow arcs across the pasture while Vera followed a few steps behind, arms crossed against the heat. He asked her, as they walked, how she'd landed on this particular 100 yards of pasture to start with, and Vera found herself explaining the deed before she decided whether it was worth mentioning. Nathan listened, nodding in the polite way people nod at things they've already decided not to take seriously, and told her that in 3 years doing this job, he'd heard every version of the old-timer story. Dowsing rods, family legends, a grandfather's dream about a spring. Sometimes they panned out. Mostly they didn't. His equipment, he said, didn't care what anybody's grandfather had believed. Nathan stopped near the stump, glanced at his readout, and shook his head. Nothing promising here, he said. Old dead root system, mostly rock underneath. He pointed instead toward a low spot near the barn, 140 yards away, where his equipment showed a stronger signal. Vera asked about the deed, about the line underlined in pencil. Nathan was polite about it. Folks used to guess at wells, he said. Trees, dowsing rods, all kinds of old habits. His machine didn't guess. The quote for drilling near the barn came to just under $9,000, more than double what a shallower well at the stump site would have cost if the stump site had anything under it worth drilling for. Vera did the math against what was left in Opal's account after the funeral and the back taxes, and the number made her sit down on the porch step for a while before she could speak again. By early afternoon, the water tank she'd rigged from a stock trailer had run down to a few warm inches, and the cattle had noticed. They stood along the fence line in a loose, restless row, heads low, the younger ones nosing at the empty trough and backing away as if it had personally disappointed them. Vera counted them twice, out of nervous habit more than need. 40 head, 40 mouths that trusted her for something she hadn't yet learned how to give them. She called the county extension office, then 2 more drilling companies further out, and got some version of the same answer each time. Without a strong signal, nobody wanted to gamble a full crew and a rig on an old pencil mark in a dead man's deed. One dispatcher laughed, not unkindly, before catching herself and apologizing. She thought about calling the whole thing off, hauling water in a tank from town for as long as it took to save up. Cattle had gone without a permanent well before. Somewhere, sometime, she told herself, though she had no idea if that was true. It was the kind of thing a person says when they're looking for a reason not to be afraid. Vera sat with the deed open on her knee until the light went orange, then gray, and the cicadas started up in the tree line the way they did every evening, whether or not anyone had solved anything that day. She thought about calling a cousin, someone who might talk sense into her about selling. She didn't make the call. Instead, she found Gideon Marsh's number written in her aunt's address book, in handwriting gone shaky near the end, and dialed it before she could talk herself out of it. That evening, she drove 2 miles down the county road to see Gideon Marsh. Gideon was 78, and he had surveyed half the property lines in that end of Oakridge County before his knees gave out on him. He still kept his old transit level on a shelf in the barn, next to a row of composition notebooks filled with numbers only he could fully read anymore. He had known Opal Kessler for 60 years. He had known the walnut tree, too, though it took Vera showing him a deed before he'd say so. He'd been the one to help Opal fix a fence line dispute with a neighbor back in the 70s. He mentioned walking Vera through his barn full of old tools before they sat down. He'd been at her table more Sunday evenings than he could count, though never once in all those years had she brought up a second door underground or a tree that had come down before Vera was even born. Some things a person keeps to themselves not out of secrecy, Gideon said, but because there was never a reason to bring them up, not until somebody needed them. That tree came down in a windstorm back in the winter of '86, Gideon said, turning the deed over in his hands like it was something alive. Lightning split first, then the wind finished it. Your aunt never had reason to replace it. She had the old well working fine most of her life. Vera asked him the only question that mattered to her. Was there really water there, or was it just something people used to believe? Gideon didn't answer right away. He set the deed down on his workbench and looked at her for a long moment, the way an older person looks at someone who has just asked a question worth taking seriously. "Walnut trees don't grow where they please," he said. "They need more water than most anything else on a farm, deep and steady, all season. Man doesn't plant a walnut on a dry ridge and hope. If your granddaddy's granddaddy marked a walnut there and called it water, it's because the walnut told him so before he ever put a shovel in the ground." He told her something else, too, something Vera hadn't known. In the old land surveys, before anyone had proper maps, surveyors used living trees as boundary markers. They called them witness trees. A witness tree wasn't decoration. It was a permanent record, written into the deed itself, meant to outlast the person who planted it. The tree in her deed hadn't just marked water. It had marked a promise that whoever came after would be able to find it, long after the man who wrote it down was gone. Gideon pulled one of his old composition notebooks off the shelf, flipping through pages of surveys he'd run decades earlier for half. The farms in a hollow, Black Walnut, he explained, ran a taproot deeper than almost anything else on a Midwest farm, and it drank more water doing it than an oak or a hickory ever would. A man walking his new land in 1890 didn't need an engineer to tell him where the water sat close to the surface. He needed to know what already grew tall and healthy on its own, without help, through every dry summer anyone could remember. If a walnut stood somewhere, it stood there because the ground beneath it had never once let it down. Vera asked whether a promise like that could still be trusted 40 years after the thing making it had died. "The land doesn't forget just because the marker did," Gideon told her, and reached for his boots. He was quiet a moment longer, lacing them slower than the task required, and added that he'd surveyed enough of these old properties to know the deeds rarely lied. People lied. Paper mostly didn't, not on purpose, not when the man writing it down had no reason to trick the grandchildren he'd never meet. They walked out to the stump together the next morning before the heat set in. Gideon moved slower than he used to, one hand resting on Vera's shoulder more than either of them said out loud. But his eyes worked the ground the way a much younger man's would have. He crouched by the stump and pressed his palm flat against the grass a few feet from it, then a few feet further, feeling for something Vera couldn't name. "The grass here runs greener than the rest of the pasture," he said, "even in a dry August. You want to look at what keeps growing when everything around it gives up. That tells you more than any machine reads off a screen." He pointed out a line of wild sedge threading through the Bermuda grass in a path Vera would never have noticed on her own, curving from the stump down toward a shallow dip in the land 40 feet off. "Sedge likes wet feet," he told her. "It doesn't grow where the ground stays dry." Somewhere under that low line, the water table was closer to the surface than anywhere else on the property, close enough that a plant had been telling the truth about it for years. Quietly, to anyone willing to look down instead of at a screen. Vera walked the line herself while Gideon rested against the stump, catching his breath in a way he tried to make look casual. She noticed things she'd walked past a dozen times that week without seeing. A patch of moss holding on at the base of a fence post, though moss had no business surviving an Ozark August. A slight give in the ground under her boot, softer than the baked clay around it. A cluster of gnats hovering low over one particular hollow, the kind that only gathered where the air stayed a degree or two cooler and damper than everywhere else. None of it would have meant anything to her 2 weeks earlier. She would have called it just grass, just bugs, just ground. Now, walking it slowly, matching her steps to where an old man's eyes had already been, she understood she was reading a kind of handwriting the land had been keeping all along, patient, unbothered by how long it took someone to notice. Gideon called her back over and knelt again, slower this time, and pressed 2 fingers an inch into the soil at the thickest part of the sedge line. He held them up for her to see. Dark, cool, faintly damp, even after 6 rainless weeks. "That's your answer, right there," he said. "Machines measure resistance. They don't know what green means. A farmer does. There's a kind of knowledge that doesn't need a name to be trusted. It doesn't come from a manual or a reading on a machine. It gets passed from one pair of hands to the next, tested against real seasons, real failures, real thirst, until it becomes something closer to instinct than information. What outlives a person isn't always the thing they built. Sometimes it's simply the truth they left pointing in the right direction, patient enough to wait for whoever finally learns to look for it. What does it mean, really, to leave something behind that still works for someone you'll never meet? Gideon had spent his whole life reading a landscape other people walked past without seeing, and none of that knowledge had ever needed the tree standing to still be true. A pair of dragonflies worked low over the sedge line, dipping close to the grass, and rising again, the kind of insect that only bothered with ground holding real moisture underneath. Vera watched them a moment before she understood why Gideon had smiled faintly at the sight of them. Even the air above that strip of pasture was keeping the same secret the roots were. Vera knelt down where the sedge line curved thickest and pushed her fingers into the soil. It was cooler there than at the stump, and darker, holding moisture the surrounding pasture had already given up for the day. She looked up at Gideon. "This is it, isn't it?" she said. Not exactly where the deed said, but this is what the deed meant. Gideon nodded slowly. 40 rods was never going to land on the exact route, he said. Nobody paces off a farm with a ruler. But your great-great-grandfather wasn't wrong. He just wasn't as precise as a man with a laptop wants him to be. The tree told the truth in a general direction. The land's been telling it more specifically ever since, if a person stays long enough to notice. Vera called Nathan back out that afternoon and asked him to run his locator over the sedge line instead of the stump itself. He was skeptical, she could tell, watching him watch an old man's hand-drawn map of wild grass instead of his own equipment. But he ran the test anyway, out of what Vera suspected was more courtesy than curiosity. Nathan crouched at the edge of the sedge line first, turning his locator over in his hands like he was deciding whether it was even worth the battery. He'd already run this pasture once, he reminded her, and found nothing worth a second look near that stump. Vera didn't argue. She just pointed at the curve of green cutting through the browned-out grass and asked him to try anyway, 40 feet further down than where he'd stopped before. The readout changed almost as soon as he crossed onto the damp ground. "Strong signal," he said, sounding surprised in a way he tried to cover with a shrug. "Consistent depth, maybe 32 feet. Better than anything I found near the barn." He walked the line twice more, checking the numbers against themselves, the way a person checks a scale they don't quite trust the first time it agrees with them. Vera watched his face more than the screen. Something in it had shifted, some small crack in the certainty he'd carried into her yard 3 days earlier. He looked back toward the stump, then at the sedge, then at Vera, and admitted, quieter than before, that he didn't have a reading for why the grass grew that way. His machine could tell her what was under the ground. It couldn't have told her where to point at first. Nathan revised the quote that afternoon, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a calculator and a look on his face like a man rewriting an assumption he hadn't known he was carrying. 32 feet was shallow, easy, no need for the deeper casing the barn site would have required. The number came in under $4,000, less than half of what he'd first proposed, and he read it out to her twice, as if saying it again might make it make more sense to him. Vera slept badly the night before the drilling. She lay awake running the numbers again in her head. The $4,000 she didn't fully have either, only slightly less impossible than the $9,000 had been. She thought about what it would mean to be wrong twice. First about keeping the farm at all, and now about trusting a 100-year-old pencil mark over a machine built to read the ground. Somewhere close to midnight, she got up, walked out to the porch in her socks, and looked toward the dark shape of the pasture where the stump and the sedge line sat waiting for morning. She couldn't see either one in the dark. She stood there anyway, the way a person stands watch over something they've already decided to trust, whether or not trusting it turns out to have been wise. The drilling rig came out 3 days later, a squat yellow machine that seemed too loud for a morning that had started so quiet. Vera stood at a distance with Gideon beside her, the two of them saying very little, the way people do when they are waiting on something that matters more than either of them wants to say out loud. Word had gotten around the way it does in a small hollow, and two neighbors Vera barely knew had wandered over on the pretense of borrowing a tool, staying instead to watch. The drill bit through topsoil first, easy going, then hit the layer of hardpan clay Gideon had warned her about, the kind that made the whole crew wince and slow the rig to a grinding crawl. Vera's stomach dropped with every foot that passed without a change in the engine's pitch. 20 feet. 25. She found herself gripping the fence rail harder than she needed to, watching Nathan's face for any sign of doubt. Then, a little past 30 feet, the sound of the engine changed. It was subtle at first, a stutter in the rhythm, and then unmistakable, a lighter note as the bit broke through into something that wasn't rock. The crew went quiet in the particular way people go quiet right before they let themselves believe something good. Water came up the casing clear and cold, and kept coming, steady enough that the driller checked his gauge twice before he believed it. 41 gallons a minute, he told Vera, which was more than enough for 40 head of cattle and a garden besides. He didn't know anything about a deed or a dead tree. He just wrote the number down on his clipboard and moved on to capping the well. The two neighbors who'd wandered over shook Vera's hand before they left, the kind of handshake that meant something different in Briar Hollow than it had ever meant in the city, and one of them said, almost in passing, that Opal would have liked seeing this. Vera didn't trust her voice enough to answer. Vera stayed a while after the crew left, standing where the stump still sat a few feet from the new well head, gray wood against the fresh, disturbed earth. She thought about her aunt keeping that underlined line in a folder for decades, never needing it herself, trusting that someone, someday, might. She thought about a tree that had been dead longer than she'd been alive, and how it had still managed to tell her something true. She walked the cattle down to the new trough that evening, 40 head moving in an easy, unhurried line, the kind of calm she hadn't seen from them since she'd arrived. They drank without hesitation, without the wary circling they'd done at every unfamiliar water source she'd offered them so far. It was a small thing, animals simply drinking, but Vera stood at the fence longer than she needed to, watching it, the way a person watches proof of something they weren't sure they'd earned yet. That night, she sat on the porch with the deed spread open on her knee again, but she read it differently now than she had 6 weeks earlier. It wasn't just a stranger's old paperwork anymore, a set of lines and measurements belonging to people she'd never met. It was a message written by someone who had never expected to be thanked for it, meant for whoever eventually needed it badly enough to go looking. She thought about the woman at the feed store and the coat that Word Farmer had felt like wearing. It fit a little differently now. Not because she'd learned everything, not because the fear of failing Opal's trust had disappeared entirely, but because she had stood in a pasture with an old man half her strength and found water where a machine had told her there was nothing, and something about doing that had rearranged the shape of who she believed she was allowed to become. Gideon came by 2 days later, ostensibly to check the new well's flow rate, though Vera suspected he mostly wanted an excuse to see it working. He stood at the fence a long while, hands in his coat pockets despite the heat, looking at the stump and the fresh well head sitting side by side. He told her that in 60 years of surveying this county, he'd read 100 old deeds with lines like that one, promises left behind by men who never explained themselves, and most of those lines had simply gone unread, folded into drawers, sold off with the land to people who never thought to look. Yours got read, he said. That's the only difference. The land was always willing. It just needed somebody willing to walk it. That fall, Vera drove into town and came back with a young black walnut sapling, no taller than her waist, its roots wrapped in burlap on the truck's seat beside her. She planted it a few feet from the new well, close enough that in 20 years, if it lived that long, its roots would reach down toward the same water the old one had once pointed to. She didn't put up a sign or tell the story to anyone beyond Gideon, who came by most weeks now on some excuse or another, and Nathan, who mentioned once almost sheepishly that he'd started asking older farmers about their land before running his equipment on a new job. She simply watered the sapling by hand that first summer, a little each evening, the way you tend something you don't expect to see finished yourself. By the following spring, the sapling had put out its first real leaves, small and pale green against the darker grass around it, and Vera had stopped introducing herself as someone just passing through Opal's old place. She'd started saying, when it came up, that she ran a farm in Briar Hollow. She still said it carefully, the way a person tries on a coat that's beginning, finally, to fit through the shoulders. Some mornings, walking out to check the cattle, Vera would pass both markers standing a few feet apart in the grass. The old gray stump, weathered soft at its edges, and beside it, the thin green sapling reaching for the same ground its grandparent once had. Neither one said a word. They didn't need to. Where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever had to trust something nobody else believed in, the way Vera trusted a line her great-great-grandfather underlined decades before she was born? We read every single comment. See you in the next story.